I was 16, my parents forced me to pay rent while my younger brother got everything for free. They said I was useless and wouldn't make it on my own. Years later, they lost their home and came begging me to save them. My response? It left them in tears. I never understood what I did to make my parents resent me so much. From my earliest memories, there was always a stark difference between how they treated me and my younger brother Alex. He was 3 years younger, but in my parents' eyes, he hung the moon and stars. I was just there, an afterthought, a burden. The summer I turned 16, my father came into my room one evening. I was working on a science project. I'd always been good at school, hoping my academic achievements might finally earn their approval. He cleared his throat and said, "Now that you're 16, you need to start contributing to this household." I looked up, confused. He continued, "Starting next month, you'll pay $300 in rent. You also need to cover your own phone bill, clothes, and school supply." I was stunned. I barely had any savings from the occasional babysitting jobs I'd picked up. "But Dad, I'm still in high school. How am I supposed to pay that much and keep my grades up?" He scoffed. "Figure it out. Everyone has to pull their weight around here. You're old enough to learn how the real world works." Then came the words that would echo in my mind for years. You need to learn responsibility now, because honestly, you're not going to amount to much otherwise. The next day, I heard my parents taking Alex shopping for new soccer gear. Expensive cleats, a premium uniform, training equipment. They spared no expense. He was 13 and hadn't worked a day in his life, yet everything was handed to him on a silver platter. I found a job at a local grocery store, working every hour I could while still maintaining my 4 GPA. I'd work after school until closing, then stay up until 2 a.m. finishing homework. Weekends were double shifts. My senior year of high school wasn't filled with football games, dances, or hanging out with friends. It was an endless cycle of work, school, sleep, repeat. My brother, meanwhile, lived like a prince. New gaming systems as soon as they were released, brand name clothes, the latest iPhone every year. When he got his driver's license at 16, my parents bought him a brand new car. I was still taking the bus to work or walking when the weather permitted. When I asked why Alex didn't have to pay rent or work, my mother would say, "He needs to focus on his future. He's going to get a soccer scholarship," or "He's still a child. Don't be jealous. It's not attractive." My father was more blunt. "Alex has potential. He's going places. You should be grateful we're preparing you for your reality." Despite working nearly full-time, I managed to graduate as valedictorian. I applied for every scholarship I could find and secured a full ride to a state university 3 hours away. The night of my high school graduation, there was no celebration. My mother made a half-hearted dinner, and my father gave me an envelope with $100. "A little something to get started," he said, as if he hadn't taken thousands from me in rent over the past 2 years. My brother didn't even attend the ceremony. He had a soccer tournament, and my parents chose to go to that instead. They left me a note: "Help yourself to the lasagna in the fridge. Congrats." College was my escape. I threw myself into my studies, working 2 part-time jobs to cover living expenses during breaks when I couldn't stay in the dorms. I limited my visits home to absolute necessities. Each time I returned, Alex had more new possessions, more privileges, more support. He had dropped soccer after failing to get that scholarship my parents had been so sure of, but that didn't change how they treated him. Now, they were funding his gap year while he figured things out. I graduated with a double major in computer science and business. The job market was hot, and I landed a position at a tech startup with an impressive salary and equity options. I found a nice apartment in the city, started building my savings, and finally began to heal from years of being the family outcast. For the next few years, I kept my distance from my family. Holiday visits were brief and tense. I'd send appropriate gifts for birthdays and Christmas, but otherwise I focused on building my own life. The startup I worked for was growing rapidly, and I grew with it, eventually becoming the head of product development. My salary tripled. I bought a beautiful condo overlooking the city. I met Jordan, my partner, who showed me what unconditional love and support actually felt like. Then came the call that would change everything. It was a Tuesday evening, and I was working late when my phone rang. Seeing my mother's name on the screen was unusual. We spoke maybe once a month, briefly and superficially. I answered with trepidation. "We need to talk," she said, her voice lacking its usual judgmental edge. Instead, she sounded desperate. "Your father and we're in trouble." The story spilled out in fragments. Bad investments, mounting debt, a second mortgage they couldn't pay, medical bills from my father's recent heart surgery. They were 3 months behind on their mortgage payments, and the bank was threatening foreclosure. They had 30 days to come up with $45,000, or they'd lose the home I grew up in. "What about Alex?" I asked. "Can't he help?" He was 25 now and still living at home. My mother's voice broke. He doesn't have anything. He's between jobs right now." What she didn't say, but I knew, was that Alex had never held a steady job. His resume was a patchwork of starts and stops, his bank account perpetually empty, despite my parents' continuous support. "We wouldn't ask if we had any other option," my father said, having taken the phone. His voice, once so authoritative when demanding my rent money, now sounded small. "We know we haven't always been fair to you, but you're our daughter. We need you." I sat in silence, memories washing over me. 16-year-old me, counting quarters to make rent while my brother got a new laptop. Missing prom because I couldn't afford a dress and had to work that night. My empty graduation ceremony. Years of hearing I was worthless while watching them pour everything into my brother. "I need to think about it," I said finally. "I'll call you tomorrow." That night I couldn't sleep. Jordan held me as I cried, not offering advice, just support, something my parents had never given me. By morning, I knew what I needed to do. I called my parents and told them I would come over that weekend to discuss everything in person. The relief in my mother's voice was palpable. "Thank you, sweetie. I knew we could count on you." When Saturday came, I drove to my childhood home with a folder of documents. The house looked shabbier than I remembered, peeling paint, overgrown lawn, a general air of neglect. Inside wasn't much better. My parents had aged significantly since I'd last seen them at Christmas. My father had lost weight after his surgery, and my mother's hair had gone completely gray. Alex lounged on the couch, playing video games on a system that looked newer than anything else in the house. He barely acknowledged my arrival. We sat at the kitchen table, the same one where I'd counted out my rent money month after month as a teenager. My parents looked at me expectantly, hope in their tired eyes. I opened my folder and pulled out a document. "I've drawn up a loan agreement," I said calmly. "I'm willing to help, but on my terms." My father reached for the paper, but I held it back. "Before you look at this, I want to talk about the past." For the next hour, I finally said everything I'd held inside for more than a decade. How their treatment had hurt me, how I'd felt unwanted and unvalued while they poured all their love and resources into Alex, how I'd worked myself to exhaustion as a child while they'd taught my brother that he was entitled to endless support. "You charged me rent at 16, I said, my voice steady despite the emotion behind it. "You told me I was useless and wouldn't amount to anything. You made me pay for necessities while buying Alex luxuries. You missed my graduation for his soccer game. You never once told me you were proud of me, even when I earned a full scholarship, even when I graduated with honors, even when I built a successful career." My mother started to interrupt, but I raised my hand. "I'm not finished. I needed to work through a lot of pain in therapy because of how you treated me. For years, I believed I was worthless, because that's what you taught me. The only reason I'm successful today is because I was forced to be self-reliant from the moment I turned 16. My father's face had gone pale. My mother was crying quietly. Alex had even put down his controller and was listening from the doorway. "Despite everything," I continued, "I'm willing to help, but not with a gift. With a loan, the same way you treated me. It's all outlined here." I slid the document across the table. "I'll pay off your immediate debt and cover the mortgage for 6 months. In return, there are conditions." The conditions were simple but firm. Alex would need to find full-time employment within 30 days and start paying rent. My parents would need to sell their oversized house and downsize to something more manageable. They would repay my loan in monthly installments once they were back on their feet. And most importantly, we would all attend family therapy together. "This isn't punishment," I explained as they read through the terms. "This is the opportunity you never gave me, a chance to learn responsibility with a safety net. I'm not abandoning you like you effectively abandoned me. I'm helping you help yourselves. My father started to protest, his pride briefly overcoming his desperation. These terms are completely reasonable, my mother interrupted, placing a hand on his arm. For the first time in my life, I saw something like understanding in her eyes. We deserve this. We didn't treat her fairly. Alex had moved to the table now. I can get a job, he said quietly. He looked different somehow, smaller, less confident. Perhaps reality was finally setting in. I should have been working anyway. I'm sorry, sis. My father looked at me for a long moment, then slowly nodded. You grew up to be stronger than I ever thought possible, he said, his voice rough with emotion. I was wrong about you, so wrong. That wasn't exactly an apology, but it was a start. As I watched them sign the agreement, I felt no triumph or vindication, just a strange mix of sadness and hope. Sadness for the childhood I'd lost, the parents I'd needed but never had. Hope that maybe, just maybe, we could build something new from the ashes of our broken relationship. There's one more thing, I said, pulling out another set of papers. I've scheduled our first therapy appointment for next Tuesday. I've already paid for the first 10 sessions. My mother reached across the table and took my hand, something she hadn't done since I was very small. Thank you, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. Not just for the money, for giving us a chance to make things right. It's been 2 years since that day. I won't pretend everything is perfect now. Healing takes time, and some wounds run too deep to ever fully disappear. But things are better. My parents sold their house and moved into a sensible condo. My father found part-time work that accommodates his health issues, and my mother started a small online business selling handmade crafts. They've repaid almost half of my loan already, sending payments faithfully each month. Alex worked at a warehouse for a year, saving money and learning what it means to support himself. Recently, he enrolled in community college, studying hospitality management. He calls me regularly for advice on classes and career paths. Last month, he thanked me for the wake-up call I needed. Our family therapy sessions were difficult but necessary. There were tears, shouting, and painful revelations. My parents finally acknowledged the favoritism that had shaped our family dynamic and apologized for the burdens they'd placed on me. I'm still working on fully forgiving them, but I'm getting there. Last Christmas, my parents came to visit the home I share with Jordan. As we sat down to dinner, my father raised his glass. To my daughter, he said, his voice thick with emotion, who taught me more about strength, resilience, and compassion than I ever taught her. I'm proud of you. I should have said that every day of your life. For the 16-year-old girl who once counted quarters at this same table, who cried herself to sleep wondering why she wasn't lovable enough, who worked her fingers raw just to survive, those words meant everything. Sometimes the family we need isn't the one we're born into, but the one we create through boundaries, honesty, and self-respect. Sometimes the greatest act of love is holding people accountable, and sometimes, just sometimes, people can change if you give them the chance, but only on terms that honor your own worth. My parents forced me to pay rent at 16 while my brother lived like a king. They called me useless and predicted I'd fail, but when they came begging for help years later, I didn't turn them away as they had effectively done to me. Instead, I offered them what they never gave me: accountability paired with support, consequences paired with compassion. Their tears that day weren't just from shame or gratitude. They were tears of recognition, finally seeing the strong, capable person I'd always been, the person they'd been too blind to see.